Welcome back again, everybody. We're going to look at another task now. This is quite an interesting task, really, particularly in terms of the tone, the category of the tone. So let's read this one out. During a recent plane journey, you sat next to a businessman who owns a chain of restaurants. You talked to him, and he suggested that you should contact him about a possible job in one of his restaurants. Write a letter to this businessman. In your letter, remind him when and where you met. Tell him what kind of job you are interested in and say why you think you would be suitable for the job. So there's quite a lot going on here, and we'll come to those keywords first of all, and then we'll talk about the tone, which is a little bit different here, a little bit unique. So keywords here, it's a recent plane journey that we were on. All of that's quite important, recent, so we'll have to mention that it was a recent one. And we sat next to a businessman. And he doesn't just manage, but he also owns a chain of restaurants. So we talked to him and he suggested, and go with that. The talk I don't think we need to highlight, because if he's suggesting something to us, of course we're talking to him. He suggested that we contact him about a possible job, not a definite job, in one of his restaurants. So there's already quite a lot to take in here. And then we come to the bullet points. We're writing a letter to this businessman, and in our letter we need to remind him. Notice the verb there. Those initial verbs are always very important. They help to give a sense of purpose to each paragraph. When and where this meeting or this informal meeting took place, where they met, essentially. Remind him when and where they met. Tell him what kind of job you are interested in. And keep in mind here the type of work that the businessman is in as well. Say why you think you would be suitable for the job. Let's just highlight all of that there. Say why you think you should be suitable for the job. Okay, so those are the keywords. It's very important that we keep, as we're writing, we might occasionally glance back to those keywords, especially by the time that we get to the end of our letter. We should be able to look back and say, yes, I talked about that, I talked about that, I talked about that, to make sure that we cover everything in an appropriate way. But now we need to talk about the tone. And you may initially feel, with some of the vocabulary here, that we want to use a very formal tone. Well, first of all, this is a job application letter, really, and we're writing to a businessman. Both of those elements would suggest that we are going to write in a very formal way. However, notice that this task has not just said, you are looking for a job in a restaurant, write a letter to the manager of the restaurant. In that case, yes, it would be entirely formal. But the way that this question is phrased puts you in a position where you must maybe question that assumption that it should be formal. Notice that we've sat next to this businessman, and think about the location. It's a plane journey. It's the sort of location where you're stuck talking to someone for a long period of time, and as a result, typically you would get quite friendly, quite chatty, quite conversational with this person. He was the one to suggest that you should contact him about a possible job, and so as a result we can tone down the level of formality. We can make it a little bit less formal. We can turn it into essentially a semi-formal letter that's perhaps a bit more, leans a little bit more towards the formal than the informal, but can still be regarded as a semi-formal piece of writing. So this one's a little bit more unique, so I'm spending a little bit of more time talking about the tone here. But occasionally you might get a strange one like this where you have to just maybe pause and think about it for a little bit before you select the tone. So we're going to go with it as a semi-formal letter, as I said. And what do we think the purpose is here? Well, I mentioned a moment ago, essentially, it really is a job application letter, but it's just not your typical one because the information that we're going to include in this job application letter is not typical. For example, that first main paragraph, we remind him when and where you met. You wouldn't typically write that in a job application letter, but it's part of this task. And it's also what helps to make it a semi-formal rather than a formal letter. So we need to remind him when and where we met. We make sure that we respond to all of the key task elements, recent, plain journey being one of them. Now we need to be specific about the details, or relatively specific, semi-formal rather than formal. We'll say what flight it was. Let's imagine it's a flight from Sydney to Singapore, something like that. And when it was, let's say, last Saturday. As I say, we can probably write last Saturday rather than writing the exact date, because this, number one, it's a semi-formal letter, so it doesn't need to be quite so specific. But more importantly, the businessman will know which flight it was. He'll remember the previous Saturday. He'll remember that you sat next to him on the flight. He'll remember that specific conversation that you had. So although your letter might reach him at a time where the dates are kind of confusing, he should still be able to know. So we'll say that it was last Saturday, and then we'll remind him of the conversation. So we'll talk about the vacancy itself. We'll mention that. Now you might say, okay, we've talked about when, but we haven't talked about where. Well, the where is pretty obvious. It was the flight from Sydney to Singapore. It's on a plane if I'm talking about a flight. So we don't need to go into too much detail there. We don't need to talk about the seat numbers. It's irrelevant really to that part of the conversation. He just needs to know. He just needs to be reminded of that conversation. Then in that third paragraph, we're going to tell him what kind of job we're interested in. So it's a restaurant. What kind of jobs would you have in a restaurant? I mean, a very obvious one. We'll come up with a chef. In fact, we'll make the vocabulary more specific. Head chef, so the top chef. We don't say the boss chef, we say the head chef. And why are we interested in that? Oh, maybe we shouldn't go that far yet. We've got that for the next paragraph, but we need to come up with a bit more information. Head chef. Maybe we can invent some details here. Maybe he was looking for a head chef, so he was trying to recruit in this area, and we might say that we are qualified. Of course, that's going to lead into the next paragraph as well, but maybe we can just say that we're qualified for that job too. So then we're going to come into that final paragraph. Why do we think we would be suitable? Well, as well as being qualified, what else is important on top of qualifications? Experience. So we can say that we have a lot of experience, or a very nice term, we have an extensive history of working in restaurants, things like that. And what else? How else can we prove ourselves here? Well, when you're applying for a job, number one, you want to talk about your qualifications. Number two, you want to talk about your experience. Number three, you want to talk about your general passion for the role. So you could sort of say love for the role. And number four, if you can, you want to talk about the fact you can provide references as well, and what those references will say about you. So we'll just say references, and then when I get to the part about references, I'll be a bit more descriptive about what information those references will provide. And that seems okay to me for a plan. So let's jump into the task here, and we will go with a dear. And let's imagine the businessman has probably given you a business card. So you will probably know his first name, because when we're introducing ourselves to each other on a flight, we don't typically give our last name, we give our first name. Hi, I'm John or Ben or whatever. But now that we're in a job application letter, although it's a little bit more semi-formal now than formal, I would still recommend going with the surname, because we're likely to know that from the business card that we were provided. So dear Mr. Taylor, I'm going to go with here. And then I can move into the purpose sentence. However, looking at this one here, the purpose of this letter specifically is to apply for a job. I think what I'm going to do is combine that with this first paragraph. So I'm actually going to edit this here. I don't usually do this. I think in this particular case, I've already written about the vacancy. I'm going to remind the reader about this now. So instead of saying I'm writing to apply for a job, which is typically what I would write, I would say I am writing to apply for a position. In this particular case, it's more important that I explain the context for writing. And the context here is crucial. There is the case of having sat next to him on a plane journey. You don't want to leave that information until later. That is crucial to know throughout. And as a result, I would put that first and then combine it with the fact that you're trying to get a job and that you've been asked to contact him. So I'm basically just going to make this my first paragraph. I hope the reasoning behind that makes sense to you. Of course, leave me any questions in the Q&A if not, but let's go with this. So we need to remind him of when and where we met. A nice way to do this is to start with something like this. I am not sure if you remember me, but. I am not sure if you remember me, but, and then remind the reader what happened. So we sat next to one another on a, now we got recent plane journey. Let's change the vocabulary to flight. On a flight, we could say recent flight, but it's pretty clear, as I'm going to write in a moment, that it's recent. So from Sydney to Singapore last Saturday, as I've written in my plan there. So I'm not sure if you remember me, but we sat next to one another on a flight from Sydney to Singapore last Saturday. And I'm not going to end the sentence here. This is all one contained thought, so I want to keep it in one, just a comma and an and. And you mentioned that I should contact you. Notice how we're showing our grammar here. We're able to change the subjects around. So we've got you should contact him, I should contact you, I should contact you about, and as I've got in the plan, a vacancy. Even better, we've got possible vacancy. Let's change that up. We can say a potential vacancy in one of, again changing the subjects there, your restaurants, and that should be okay. It's not too long. When you write that, it's still in a sense a purpose sentence. It's just one really long sentence. Looks more like a paragraph here, but notice it shouldn't be too much longer than that. There's really no need for it. So let's go into the next paragraph here, where we're going to tell him what kind of job that we're interested in. And as I said, we've got this idea that he actually had a particular job that he thought would be good for us. And a nice way to, again, bring in a little bit more of a semi-formal tone here is to remind him of the exact nature and course of the conversation. We can say something like this. If I recall correctly, and again, you're starting to look at more conditional grammar. You got a little bit in the beginning there. I'm not sure if you remember me. Even more here, we're switching the clauses around. If I recall correctly, you were hoping to, and then we use that verb down there, to recruit a new, and the job title here, head chef for, now again, we want to come back to the task itself. We know he has a chain of restaurants, not just one restaurant. We've mentioned it a bit here. Let's mention it a bit more here. For one of your two Sydney branches. It makes sense to be in Sydney. That's one of the airports that's in question here. So one of your two Sydney branches. Okay, that seems decent. Let's carry on. And again, I want to keep referring back to the shared knowledge. As mentioned on the flight, and as mentioned on the flight, this is, I want you to notice that this little clause is sort of nested within here as well. You keep improving the complexity of your grammar, the complexity of your sentence constructions when you're able to use these little nested clauses if you're using them in the right way. If that seems a bit challenging, don't worry too much. You could always split this into 2 sentences, but if you're able to if your level is high enough to create this sort of complexity, then that will go down very well with your grammatical range and accuracy score. So this is a position. Again, we want to keep using nice job-related vocabulary. This is part of one of the key elements of the topic here. This is a position which, so defining relative clause, which I am both interested in. So we're very clear here. We're covering the task requirements. We need to say what kind of job we are interested in. And as I've said here, qualified. And what we want to say, a nice collocation, fully qualified, and then the verb in this case, fill. You fill a position. You fill a position when it comes to getting a new job. So it's slightly formal, some of this language. It's definitely job application language, but there is a little bit of a semi-formal vibe to it, particularly the aspect of continuing to remind the reader of the conversation that you've had. And now we can move into what's probably going to be the longest paragraph here, because we've got 2 relatively short paragraphs and we don't have a purpose sentence. So we're going to say, say why we think we would be suitable for the job. Now, I'm going to invent some details here. I'm thinking back to this imaginary conversation that we've had. Let's imagine that, yes, in the conversation, the businessman said that they needed a head chef. You mentioned that you are qualified to fill it and that you're interested in it. But let's imagine that you didn't really get much time to talk about your experience. And in this case, what that means is we can use a complex sentence. We can start with a subordinating conjunction like although. So although we didn't talk about this, I can talk about it now to you. So although we did not get, let's say, enough time to discuss my experience on the plane. And again, you've got this nice sense of shared experience here. Notice I haven't written work experience. Work is implied. Of course, there are different definitions for the word experience, but we know we're applying for a job. There's no need to write work experience in this case here. You can just say my experience. And that's the same for a formal letter as well. You don't need to write work experience. You can just say my experience. My experience on the plane, I do, in fact, have. Now that in fact works to emphasize the point you're trying to make. So it's not that you didn't talk about it because you have no experience. So you use that in fact to emphasize that you do have a lot of experience. And as I've got down here, we've got that nice vocabulary. I do in fact have quite an extensive history, we could say, an extensive history of working in. And now with a head chef, you're not just working in, but you're actually running a kitchen. So let's write that. Working in and running kitchens of, and again, let's invent some details here, an opportunity to bring in some more vocabulary. High profile. So like very important restaurants, sort of VIPs go there. A high profile restaurants. And that seems okay to me. So we've got that extensive history. We want to talk about loving the role. We want to talk about the references. I'm going to start with talking about the references. So I'm going to start with just that. So yeah, as my previous employers, these are the people giving you the references, as my previous employers, notice that we're switching up the grammar here. Will be happy to confirm. You could also just say will confirm, but the will be happy to confirm. It's polite. Again, more of a formal tone, but still not so much that it's stuffy. Will be happy to confirm. I always, let's say, and we're going to give, like I said here, you want to say what information will be included in this reference. The information that you will learn is that I always coped well under pressure. So we've got some nice collocations coming through here. Maybe moving to slightly less formal, but by no means informal. It's totally fine. I always coped well under pressure. And what else? And let's say, and there were very few instances of customers being unhappy with their food. Okay, I could say with their experience. I just don't really want to write experience twice in the same paragraph, particularly when they have quite different definitions in these cases. So unhappy with their food, unhappy with their meals, whatever you want to write there. Notice that we want to just be talking in the past simple, not in the present perfect. You might want to say that you have always coped well under pressure, that yes, you had this skill in the past and you have it now, but it's not appropriate in this case because we're talking about a specific time in the past when you worked past with these employers in the past. So don't make the mistake of moving into the present perfect here. If you were generally talking about your abilities, then you might say, I have always coped well under pressure, but that is not the case here. Okay, and we want to finish it up by talking about our love for the role. So we'll keep it nice and simple. Of course, it certainly helps. And when I'm saying it certainly helps, I am saying it certainly helps being able to cope. So it's easier to cope when you love something. It's easier to make people happy when you love doing what you do. So of course it certainly helps, and that's where it becomes a little bit more semi-formal, that I loved the role. I loved the role. Again, notice we are using that past simple because we're talking about those specific jobs that we had. And we only need to really say role rather than roles. You could get away with either, but I'm writing role here because we want to emphasize that we were always a head chef. It wasn't when we were a chef or a sous chef, just a chef, a head chef. So it helps that I loved the role. And of course, that's more useful job application vocabulary as well. We've gone from job to position to role, vacancy, lots of good job application vocabulary here. Now, if we look at the word count, it might be a bit on the short side. No, it's actually okay. It's 153. So you can see how 150 words is actually not very many at all. However, I am going to close this letter off with one more sentence because I want to refer back to the fact that I had a conversation with this person in real life. So you want to be polite in a semi-formal way, less of a formal way. So I'm going to just ask if his, or say that I hope his vacation went well. Let's imagine that he told us he was going on vacation. So I hope your vacation in Singapore went well. You could say went well, even better. Went smoothly. Nice collocation. And then a comma because we want to move to a different part of the sentence. And I look forward to hearing from you soon. So if I just say I look forward to hearing from you soon, that's okay, but it's very formal. So adding that beginning part just helps to reduce that level of, very stuffy office-like formality. And yeah, just it's a bit more appropriate for a letter of this type. And then that leads to the question of how we should sign off the letter. And you could go with a yours sincerely. It would be okay. But again, because I just want to push on the slightly more informal side, I'm going to go with the best regards. I'm hoping that leads to a good chance of getting the job because it suggests that we're a bit friendlier. I already am in a good place with the person that I'm writing to. And then we'll finish it off with a name. Let's go, I don't know, a Graham Rayner. And there we go. So a little bit more of a tricky task here in terms of, first of all, having a lot to address. And I think that we have addressed it all here. We talked about a recent plane journey. We sat next to this businessman. We talked about how it's a chain of restaurants. We've contacted him. We know it's a possible job, not a definite one. And in only one of his restaurants, we've mentioned that as well. We covered all of those bullet point directives. So we're really nailing the mark on task achievement. And we're also doing well in terms of the tone, which is admittedly quite tricky here. I don't think you would be penalized if you just wrote it in a very formal way, but it is important, I think, to reference the fact that you had this shared conversation, you had this shared experience, and I think that naturally leads you to write in a slightly less formal way. But perhaps something like this will come up in your exam. It's good to be prepared. It's less likely, but it's certainly useful to have this in your locker. So if you have any questions, as always, leave them in the Q&A. I'll leave you to do the gap fill exercises, and I'll see you in the next lecture.